Hi, my name's Joanne Nova. I used to be a Green and then I grew up. I'm here to give you the other side of the story. The story you may not have heard well, you definitely haven't heard on the media. There's a David and Goliath battle going on the internet at the moment. Thousands of scientists are working online. They're pulling down data from NASA and NOAA in their spare time, and they're finding mistakes and errors in graphs and publishing papers, but you wouldn't know about this if you get your news from the mainstream media. Everybody wants to save the planet, don't they? One of the things I never realised though, when I was a Green and I thought carbon dioxide was important to our climate, was just how badly people want to save the planet. Did you know that Deutsche Bank is so concerned about the environment that they installed a 70-foot high tower in near Madison Square Gardens? It's got an LED clock counting CO2 emissions. I wonder when Deutsche Bank will install a clock for humpback whales, perhaps when they can trade humpback whale credits. Deutsche Bank was so concerned they've put out a 50-page report on addressing the major skeptic arguments. But this is a science debate. What are banks doing in a science debate? Well, banks care about the environment, didn't you know? All the banks do. It's not just Deutsche Bank, it's Goldman Sachs, it's JP Morgan, it's Barclays Bank, all of them. And there's a very good reason why they do care. And that is that last year $120 billion was turned over in global carbon trading markets. It's a very large investment portfolio. $243 billion was turned over in renewable energy. So the David and Goliath battle that's going on online is the opposite of the one you hear about in the mainstream media. You might think that the little guys are the greenies battling against the fierce oil-funded deniers, but in fact the little guys, the grassroots movement, are actually the small scientists, the retired scientists working online, mostly unpaid, taking on giant institutions and large multinational green groups like World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace, which now earn in the order of $300 to $500 million a year. The vested interests in this debate, which I was unaware of until recently, are enormous. All of these financial groups have trading arms in the carbon market. Would you be surprised that when there's so much money on the table, why wouldn't they have a trading arm to get in on this? And of course nothing in terms of money tells us anything about the science. That's another story, the evidence. But what I wanted to explain today is just simply why it's worth paying attention to what's going on online and to what you might be missing out on in the mainstream media. In 2008, there were 2,400 lobbyists working in Washington. This is a big industry business. It's not just the banks, but things like the United Nations Environment Program, the World Meteorological Organization, NOAA, NASA. They get billions of dollars in funding every year for science-related projects, and only projects which are related to finding a problem with CO2, not projects that are related to being sceptical of the role of CO2 in the climate. The Australian government, of course, has a Department of Climate Change, as do many other governments around the world. There's departments of climate and energy in most countries. Groups like Panasonic and Kyocera and Sharp all hope to sell their electric batteries to you, or their photovoltaic cells, and there's huge industries in that business too. With so much money on the table, is it any wonder that science is being exploited? Science, like any human activity, can be affected by a massive one-sided funding. Science is broken. There are industries out there devoted to calling some scientists deniers. Calling people deniers is just another form of bullying. There are dedicated smear sites set up by PR companies, like this one, DSmogBlog, run by PR groups in order to smear the names of good scientists who've been working in this debate to speak their views on the other side of the science. They tell us there's a consensus. They don't mention that even though it's 97% of climate scientists who hold a similar opinion, that's only 75 people. They don't mention that 31,500 scientists have signed a petition saying that they don't believe in the foreseeable future that there's any need to be concerned about rising CO2 levels' effects on the climate. They don't tell you that 9,000 of those people have PhDs and that survey has been done not just once but twice by volunteers. This is the largest whistleblowing uprising in science that's ever occurred, and yet it's not making even the back page of a newspaper, let alone the front page headline. If 31,500 scientists can't make the front page of a newspaper, what do they have to do? So they tell us there's a consensus, and there is largely in government-funded scientists, but there are thousands of independent, unfunded scientists online who have different opinions. So how did it come to this? Well, it's money, of course. Follow the money and you find that while Exxon has funded skeptics to the tune of around about $24 million over a 10-year period, on the other side of the equation, just the US government alone has spent in the order of $79 billion over the last 20 years to fund climate science research. Now, a lot of that is honest money going into honest research, but no one's paid any money to find the other side of the story. We paid to find a crisis, ladies and gentlemen, and we got what we paid for. You can see here when Al Gore was in the White House as Vice President, it was easy to start putting money into asking honest, dutiful scientists to do their jobs. $79 billion has gone into one side of the equation, one theory, and dutiful one-eyed scientists report bland, repetitive and largely irrelevant reports, and then these are released by journalists who count the press releases, who ignore the science, and they discover a meaningless consensus. Surprise! The media rubber stamps the UN committee reports without any investigation, and governments say we need more of your money, and the cycle starts again. There's a global warming gravy train to consensusville. It's filled with billions of dollars, and is it any wonder that it always ends up on the express track to a crisis? Who audits the IPCC? And the answer is online people like this, Steve McIntyre and Anthony Watts. They're scientists doing what they feel is their professional and patriotic duty, largely unpaid, in order to get to the other side of the story, to check the numbers, and to audit the messages being put out by large groups who aren't necessarily looking at the other side of the question. Ladies and gentlemen, a trial without a defence is a sham. Business without competition is a monopoly. And science without debate is propaganda. You need to think for yourself and not just assume that everyone else is doing it for you. Ladies and gentlemen, the eco-heroes out there may have good intentions and they think they're riding a green wave, and in a sense they are. It's just a different kind of green to the one that they thought they were riding. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't need a PhD to know that something is fishy about this debate. Here's a maximum minimum thermometer that NOAA uses around the US and around the world to record temperatures. They're very accurate to within 0.2 of a degree, and NOAA has strict standards on where they should be placed. Now, it took a team of volunteers to go around and photograph hundreds of these stations to find which ones met NOAA's standards and which ones didn't. And the results were that NOAA put these in the right place around about 11% of the time. That's right, almost 90% of the time, these thermometers were near artificial heat sources or cooling sources or something which changed the temperature trend. Here's a thermometer here. You can see it stuck next to the wall. Now remember, we're measuring 0.7 of a degree over 100 years. There's the thermometer. Next to concrete, next to exhaust vents, next to shadows, air conditioning ducts. Here's another one, a Stevenson screen over a car park. Now, they can adjust these with statistics, and they can tell you that having adjusted them, having compared stations all around the world, that it makes no difference to temperature trends. But you and I both know that hot air rises off concrete, and you can use statistics to tell you anything. Here's another thermometer. You can see here thermometers which have been in place for over 100 years, which once were next to horses and buggies. Moving closer to see these ones, these sensors in Melbourne are next to around about 50 to 100,000 cars a day and 9 lanes of traffic and a tram. We know that these thermometers are not recording the same kind of temperature trends that they would have recorded in, say, 1880, when people were driving past with horses and buggies. Here's another one. Someone's come along and installed some air conditioning vents next to the thermometer, possibly not realising what the thermometer was. And we all know what comes out of air conditioning vents on the outside of buildings, and it sure isn't cold air. These temperature sensors were exposed by volunteers who went round and photographed them. The teams of scientists who tell you that the world is warming due to CO2 were not the ones who discovered how badly placed these thermometers were. They just weren't looking. Could we find bigger air conditioners? We can, and we do. These are industrial air conditioning vents, just another example of a thermometer near a car park and near large industrial air conditioning outputs. Could we find even larger ones? We can, and we do. That's right, the turbine engines of a jet plane. In fact, 55% of all the thermometers around the world are close to airports. All those square kilometres of tarmac and heat that absorb heat all day and give it back all night to affect those minimas which we're told are rising. Now here's an interesting one. The red dots, the pink dots, are thermometers placed around the world in our official records. Now notice in 1980 a funny thing happens. We've got less of them. We'll watch that trend again. Starting in 1920, there are lots of thermometers in the US, and they gradually spread all around the world as we get better and better records. Then around 1980 and 1990, we started to get very concerned about CO2, and a funny thing happens to the thermometers. All that money went into the research, and all those thermometers disappeared from the official records. Now there's lots of ways you can choose which thermometers are in and which thermometers are out, and there's plenty of room there for people to adjust the results to get an answer that they're looking for. And here's the point that swung me around. I was shocked when I discovered the Vostok ice core graphs. You've probably seen this graph. This is the graph that Al Gore uses in his movies. You can see that temperature and CO2 rise and fall together. What we didn't know when we first looked at this graph 20 years ago was that it was not the CO2 driving the temperature, but the temperature driving the CO2. If you look closely at this graph, with data that came out between 1999 and 2003, you can see the temperatures rise first and that CO2 rises second. And Kellogg et al. Published a study showing in 2003 that there was about an 800-year lag. The temperatures rise 800 years before carbon dioxide, and temperatures fall thousands of years before carbon dioxide. You can see for yourself in this graph, actually, there's around 15,000 years where carbon dioxide was steady, and temperatures steadily fell by a whopping 6 degrees from peak to trough, and carbon dioxide didn't make any difference to that. So looking at these graphs, you can also see that current temperatures are about where the red line is, that things were warmer around 130,000 years ago. What changed for me with this graph was that I had no idea that this research was published until 4 years after it was published. Where were the media reports? Once I realised that we weren't getting the whole side of the story, that was the point when I realised I had to start doing my own research. And I got so concerned about the state of science and the way science was being reported that I set up my own website, joannenova.com.au. So if you have any more questions and you'd like some more information, or you want to see the Skeptic's Handbook, which I produced in 2008, it's all there, it's all free. Come and visit us at joannenova.com.au.